cyber camouflage, surveillance cameras, motion sensors, body scanners. They don't see you. That's why you were called Ghostrunners.
Every once in a while, some game gets released out of nowhere for me and consumes my life for its game length. Some games just nerd snipe me in such a specific way that I can't help but play them from beginning to end in one go. It's one of two things that makes such a game. It's either a very well-written, heavily narrative game, which manifests itself as almost like watching a movie, or it is a hard-as-nails test of skill. The latter is particularly interesting because of what it does to the mind. Playing the game is almost trance-like. With most being quite short, it means that you enter a kind of portal when you start the game, and you only really think about that game while you're in the middle of it. It's a lot like creating these videos, actually. Your world becomes one and the same as the game world because your mind is just engaged with it. When you walk away from the computer, you're still reflecting on what you did in the game and what you could potentially do in the future. It's really no different than thinking about work on your drive home. The game just is your life for a short period. Because of that, leaving the portal is just as much a part of the experience as being in it. With these type of games, uninstalling them after beating them feels like the true ending. Not really because you're defeating an addiction or whatever. These games tend to be pretty boring after you're mentally done with them, but just because it's like closing a book after you're finished reading it. The last page isn't the ending, it's the back cover. Hyper-abstract analogies aside, if you read my descriptions, you know that I sometimes hint at the next video. And, well, considering that this video isn't about a 2008 first-person shooter, you can safely bet that another one of those trance-inducing games was released. This time, it's a game called Ghostrunner, where you play as a wannabe Genji main katana enthusiast on a mission to liberate a post-apocalyptic cyberpunk city from its ruling tyrant who wants to turn everyone into that one demon from Doom. But forget the story, because the game sure does, because we're here for the gameplay. Since Ghostrunner's gameplay is a brutal, high-speed action platformer, that's actually better described as a puzzle game, because, well, combat here is not hard. Just click the right mouse button and almost everything dies in one hit. The fun comes from figuring out how to do that, usually by figuring out how to properly approach enemies and close the distance. Your movement abilities are just as much a part of the combat as the sword you're holding. Pretty much everyone here has a gun, and those who don't can become projectiles themselves. Your swings here seem to be as powerful as these pea shooters because you are just as vulnerable, since every single attack in this game kills you in one hit. Really fits with the fantasy, I think, because it means that your runs for each area are either perfect or result in death. Three main abilities are introduced right away: a wall run that's faster than running, a grapple to set points in the level, and a dash ability. It thrusts you forward like a dash but has no invincibility frames because you're not really supposed to dodge here. Instead, it's used to get close to enemies. Holding the dash button gives you a few seconds of time dilation, which you can use to slip around bullets while approaching. At least that's how it's introduced, but of course this kind of thing lets you pull off all kinds of ridiculous stunts. The grappling hook is less impactful because of its inherently limited nature requiring grapple spots, but these are placed often enough in combat rooms to be another method of closing the distance in creative ways. When things go right, encounters in Ghostrunner go beautifully. Entering a new area begins by a telegraphing of the general layout of things according to the placement of grapples and walls. Following the obvious path lets me discover the locations of enemies and how their line of sight might cover other areas, and even though I fully expect to die here, I can now begin formulating a plan of attack, covering everything from priority of enemies based on what I personally struggle to deal with, and angles from which I can approach. This plan gets tweaked as my attempts continue, but then comes the execution. I must perfectly pull off every single move to clear this area. Of course, this results in a lot of deaths. Usually, I find this kind of thing infuriating, dying at the same spot over and over again, but death is very much a fundamental part of the game. Recognizing how tiny the margin of error is with this system, the game embraces failure in a way, with death rolling immediately into the next run. No dramatic death screen, no sound effects, just a single button prompt, R, right next to your fingers, to immediately snap back to the beginning of the level to continue, uninterrupted by a loading screen. Proving this dedication to encouraging perfecting runs comes from the music. It is uninterrupted from one life to the next. Dying doesn't affect it, respawning doesn't affect it. It's a constant tie between lives. There's no death, really. The game continues on. Past the introduction, my index finger was pressing R before the prompt even came up, trained exactly to recognize death moments before the bullet actually makes contact, rolling from one run to the next. And then, well, the movement just feels good. The very high speed and sometimes generous hitboxes for certain jumps make a successful traversal feel like you're pulling off absurd stunt after absurd stunt. And the distinctly cyberpunk-esque backdrops absolutely fit in with this theme of being a space ninja. And hey, Cyberpunk got delayed again, so gotta scratch that itch somehow. But, well, the outlook isn't as great in other areas. I've seen the devs put this game at around 8 to 10 hours of content, and I very much disagree. On my first playthrough, knowing nothing about this game, not even really playing a ton of games in this kind of genre, while playing pretty casually and trying to get good footage for this video, my total game time clocked in at just below 5.5 hours. And I'm already not amazing at video games, so this causes all kinds of problems. First of all, this game is obviously all about mastering its systems, right? Well, just about when you do that, the game ends. Usually what I want from this kind of heavily skill-based game is an initial set of missions where I master the skills at hand, then a second set where the game can actually begin to challenge me by throwing harder and harder levels at me to work through with my newly acquired skills. Ghostrunner begins to hint at this at the later levels, but just as things are beginning to get good, the game's final boss fight begins. On that note, there are 3, maybe 4, depending on how you count it, bosses in this game. The first, Tom, is good fun and an absolute visual spectacle. It starts out with you wondering how the hell you can possibly beat it in the first few minutes until you overcome the challenge and you suddenly realize that you are a match for it after all. The second one is against Hell, which shares many aspects with the third, and I think that they suffer from the one-hit kill rule that the game abides by because it severely restricts how they can be designed. This rule is broken here actually because they take a few hits to take down. Of course, this is a number way smaller than boss fights in other games, so the theme of extreme lethality is not spoiled too much, but the main problem is that this fight has to just come down to movement challenges. Same thing with the final boss. You just dodge her attacks until she becomes vulnerable. You're not actually fighting them, you're just waiting for them to pull off the attack that lets you counterattack. It's actually an absurdly easy fight. And don't even get me started on the real final boss fight, where you walk around dodgeballs in a featureless void. Seriously, you have these gorgeous visuals already made and you decide to go with the Assassin's Creed loading screen visual. Why? The problem is, the moments of brilliant gameplay are actually somewhat sparse. A lot of this game is just traversing from one area to the next, which is fine, to be honest. As I mentioned, just moving in this game feels great, but why put the checkpoint behind the zipline section? Thankfully, I only died once in the encounter, but, well, a player that struggles more with this enemy type might end up gliding on that rail many times. It feels like padding. All things considered, the actual extremely good gameplay is sandwiched between these less interesting sections that involve the story. It's reasonably interesting. A utopic mega tower is built after the apocalypse by a duo of brilliant scientists, only for one to betray the other and turn the tower into a tyrannical dictatorship, where those in the bottom floors live in abysmal conditions manufacturing products for those living in the city, who live in a cutthroat competition primarily to fund the experiments of the tyrants at the top. Certainly could make for an interesting backdrop, and visually they usually do, but because of the nature of this kind of game, these settings can't be explored in a meaningful way. Really, everything I said about them involves a significant amount of reading between the lines. Instead, they kind of just blend together. A character even makes a comment on it.
Seems like there's a curfew in effect. Turns out people here are just as oppressed as the basers.
With a story that is this defined, Ghostrunner should be using its world for storytelling, but instead defaults to these featureless cyber voids again and again, needlessly long and mind-numbing sections that have me waiting for platforms to move back and forth in a high-speed first-person action game. This is also where new special abilities are introduced, 4 meter-based skills that really should not be in this game. They're all overpowered. They let me clear rooms with no effort. Without them, I would have to learn to fight 5 of this enemy type at once, which might have been a difficult and rewarding challenge late in the game, but instead I can just finish them off immediately with a skill. The scale isn't there to make these abilities make sense. Their nature seems quite antithetical with the game. Instead of being interesting movement-based abilities to complement the normal arsenal and gameplay of Ghostrunner, they just kill everything immediately. All in all, I would say that around 2/3 of the game is truly incredible, but the other third does drag it down. Unfortunately, this means that only around 4 hours of truly great content exists here, due to the already quite short playtime. It's difficult for me to ask for more content in a situation like this. Ghostrunner is a game made by a smaller and new-ish developer, which means that it's unreasonable to ask for a larger investment into a game with unknown prospects. However, I think that some potential was lost here. It's clear what the strong point of this game is. I think that the game should have stuck harder to it. These visuals are gorgeous, but I wonder how much more could be done if levels were just a little bit easier and a little bit cheaper to make. I think that this game would benefit a lot from a more Fury-like story, quite vague, somewhat abstract, as it would give a lot more flexibility in its design decisions, and might have let us get away with fewer of these god-awful cyber void sequences. It's clear to me that this aesthetic was part of the original vision of Ghostrunner. It's admirable that the game realized this vision in some parts. However, I can't help but wonder how much better of a game Ghostrunner would be if it sacrificed a little bit of that vision to allow for more actual game. As it stands, Ghostrunner is a great time with some just incredible gameplay, but I suspect that its flaws will have it falling just short of becoming somewhat of a classic.
Citywide lockdown is now in effect. An armed and dangerous criminal has been spotted in the area. All Dharma City residents should remain indoors for their own safety. Residents found outside their homes will be shot on sight.